Okay, let us continue our journey of C++. Let us explore the concept of constructors and destructors a bit further. This particular program is very important because not only it has the implementation of constructor overloading, but along with that we are going to revise a few more topics like friend function, their rules and their implementations, returning object as argument along with passing objects as arguments. So, basically this particular program will be a very good revision for you all right. Whatever the part that has been selected over here in the left hand screen, that is the class definition. There the class name is complex. This class is having two variables x and y defined in the private section. In the public section we have three different types of constructors. The first one, there is default constructor, the second one, that is with one argument, and finally the constructor with two arguments. Along with that we had declared a function named sum and show. These two functions are not member function of the class, but they are the friends to the class complex. Whenever a function is not a member function of a class, but it is just a friend to the class, that means these functions, both these functions sum and show, both of these functions will be able to access all the properties of class complex even though they are not a part of the class. So, that is going to be the benefit, and that is going to be the good practice, good revision to understand the actual concept of friend function. Okay, basically whenever we are dealing with the friend function, there are three different rules. Rule number one, it is declare a function friend to the class. See what we had done here. We had declared both these functions as a friend to the class. So, that is point number one, rule number one. Rule number two, definition of these functions, definition of this friend function must be outside the class, outside the main definition, because they are not part of anything. So, that is what we had done. After the completion of the class definition, here in the common space we had defined both these functions. And rule number three, make a call to these functions like a ordinary function, like a normal functions. That means we do not need to make use of an object, or we do not have to make use of scope resolution operators. Like a normal function calling, we will be definitely making a call to sum or to show functions. Yes, definitely we will take care of a particular part, that is passing of objects as arguments. In order to make a call to the sum function, we have to pass two objects of class complex as an argument. In order to make a call to the show function, we just have to pass one object of the class complex. Now, if you just take a look at the return type of sum function, see everyone, we are talking about the return type, that means this particular part. Sum function, whenever it has been called, it is going to return something. In this case, it is a returning an object of class complex. That is why the return type has been mentioned as a complex. In another instance, in another declaration, the return type of show, that is void, that means that function is not returning anything at all. If you just take a look at the definitions, you will be getting the clear idea. Say there is the definition of function sum, which has been definitely outside the class definition and above the main function definition. This function definition is receiving two objects as argument of class complex, see C1 and C2. This function, that is sum we are talking about, this function is returning one object of class complex, that is the return type complex, and what you are seeing over here return C3, that is basically the object of class complex, the newly created object which has been initialized and later on finally thrown back to the main function. In case of show function, it is not returning anything. So, return type that has been declared as a void and definitely not returning anything, but still accepting one object as argument. Simply the job of this function is to print all the properties of class, that is x and y variables. Alright, let us get back to the main function definition, where exactly we are going to define the objects, we are going to initialize the objects, and later on we are going to make calls to the friend functions. That will be the actual practice. Okay, over here complex A in the bracket 2.7 3.5, that means an object has been created. For example, this is an object A has been created, and whenever there is a creation of an object, definitely constructor calling has been done. So, for this particular object, object A, we are going to look for a definition of constructor with 2 arguments, definitely. Okay, that means we are talking about this particular constructor definition. The values will be temporarily received in R and I, and from there the values will be passed on to the object A inside x and y variables. So, that is how object A is going to be initialized. Alright. So, right after that there is one more object. Once again, let us for an example, this is object B. The moment we create an object B, once again the constructor is going to be called, but this time the constructor with 1 argument. So, let us go look for the constructor with 1 argument. Fine, right here 1.6 will be temporarily stored in A, from there it will be passed on to x and y. So, object B will be initialized with 1.6 in x, 1.6 in y. So, that is the completion of second object. So, we are having 2 objects A and B, both initialized. Let us go for object C. Alright, complex C, that means that is the creation of an object. See, mind it, we don't have any arguments to be passed. That means the constructor without any arguments, for example, this is object C. So, for this particular object C, constructor without arguments, that is the default constructor, is going to be called, and C will be initialized with x and y garbage values. So, these are the creation of all the 3 objects A, B and C. First object with 2 arguments, second object with 1 argument, and third object with default constructor. Okay. Now, this is going to be interesting. This particular part is the function calling of a friend function. We just cleared that friend function must be called like a normal function. Okay, so sum function is going to be called without using any object, without using any kind of scope resolution operators. So, we had made a call to the sum function, and along with the function call, we had passed 2 objects, newly created 2 objects, that is A and B. Both the objects are being passed. Object A and object B, both objects are getting passed as an argument. Remember the concept of call by value, call by reference. That means what we are trying to do is we are trying to pass a bunch of values stored in A. All bunch of values will be passed on, just like that. B, another bunch of values will be passed on. These 2 objects, all the values inside these objects will be thrown to the function definition of sum, and these values inside the sum function, just everyone take a look at the sum function. Inside sum function, 2 more objects will be created temporarily, because the scope of the function, because the scope of those objects will be limited to sum function only. So, all the values of A object will be copied to C1. All the objects of B will be copied into C2. So, that is going to be done. Alright, now we have 2 more objects only limited to the function sum, that is it. Okay, inside sum function there is 1 more object, newly created object, that is C. Once again, the scope of all the 3 objects will be limited only up to the function sum. So, we had created 1 more object C3, which is having x and y. Once again, this time the default constructor is going to be called for all the 3 instances, for C1, for C2, for C3. We haven't passed any argument. That means for all the 3 objects, default constructor is going to be called, and x and y of all the objects will be initial is garbage. Alright, in case of C3, the content of C1, content of C2 belonging to x is going to be added into newly created object C3. Alright, if you just remember, the actual values of A will be copied in C1, the actual values of B object will be copied into C2. Alright, these values of x and y from 2 different objects will be added in, stored into C3 object. So, now we are having C3 object initialized with x and y both. Okay, finally, when we are ready with C3 object, when it has all the values in x and y, one more thing, one last thing, and that is return C3. That means this newly created object, newly initialized object is going to be thrown back, is going to be returned. And who is going to catch it? Who is going to catch it? Okay, if you just take a look over here, whatever the object some function is throwing back will be copied into C. That means this newly created object with newly initialized values will be directly copied into C3. Okay, that means now we are having all the three objects A, B and C properly initialized. Then we can step forward for printing these values. Okay, once again we are going to make a call to the show function. Mind it, function show is again a print function which is expecting an object as argument. So the object A is going to be passed into function show. All the values of a object will be temporarily stored into C object, and as you can see, x and y are getting printed. That means 2.7 and 3.5 for object A is getting printed. Right after that we are back to the main function. Whose turn now? Okay, now we are talking about object B. We are throwing all the values of B and getting that stored into C temporarily. Okay, so over here show function is going to print 1.6 and 1.6. Fine, and just like that we can print object C as well. Okay, that part is intentionally skipped because that is understood. Okay, another part of the same main definition, that is the implicit constructor calling for PQR objects. That means we are going to make the same practice for 3 more objects, but this time the constructor calling is made explicitly. In the first part, let me show. In the first part, the constructor calling was implicit. In the second part over here, constructor calling is explicit. That is the only difference between both the parts. Once again, like I already told you, the basic purpose of this program is to revise so many concepts, so many topics that you had just covered. Alright? So hopefully this particular practice was good for your revision.